A Korean Mafia boss who controls half of Asia's underworld couldn't see the monster living inside his own home. His fiancée, the woman he was about to crown as queen of his empire, had been breaking a young mother's body and spirit every single day behind his back. For months, she got away with it. Until a 3-year-old girl pointed her tiny finger and said 7 words that collapsed an empire of lies. Stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, hit that like button. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. But the alarm never went off at 4:30 in the morning because Amara Johnson hadn't slept. She'd been lying on the narrow cot in the staff quarters since 2, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked, in bad light, like a hand reaching downward. Nyla was curled against her side, one small fist pressed beneath her cheek, breathing the slow, even rhythm of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of mornings. Amara listened to that breathing the way a person drowning listens for something solid, with everything she had, because it was the only thing keeping her from thinking too hard about the day ahead. She got up without making a sound. The staff quarters at the Kang estate sat in the east wing's lower level, separated from the main house by a long corridor tiled in pale stone that held the cold like a vault. Amara pulled on her uniform in the dark. The black dress, the white collar, the sensible shoes that had worn through at the left heel 3 weeks ago. She didn't turn on the light. She knew every inch of this room by now, every corner and edge, the way a person knows a cage they've stopped pretending they can leave. She pressed her palm flat against Nyla's back for a moment before she left, just to feel the rise and fall. Then she went to work. The Kong mansion occupied nearly 2 acres of private land on the northern edge of Gangnam, surrounded by sculpted hedges and security walls that rose 4 meters and were topped with something that was never publicly discussed. From the street, if you happened to be driving past at the right hour, you might glimpse the upper floors through the iron gate, pale stone and dark glass, austere and enormous, the kind of building that did not invite curiosity. Most people who noticed it looked away quickly. That was the point. Inside, it was different. Inside, it was all marble and recessed lighting and Korean antiques arranged with the precision of a museum exhibit. There were fresh flowers in every public room, changed every 2 days by a florist who had a standing contract and knew better than to ask questions. There were paintings on the walls worth more than most people's homes. There were staff, 6 full-time, 4 part-time, moving through the corridors in the efficient, nearly invisible way that good household staff learns to move when they understand their employer's temperament. Kang Tae-hyun's temperament was not complicated, but it was absolute. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. He did not tolerate inefficiency, dishonesty, or cruelty within the walls of what he considered his domain. These were the rules he had established when he first took possession of the estate 9 years ago. And in 9 years, they had never required revision because no one had yet been stupid enough to violate them in front of him. The key phrase being, in front of him. Amara started with the east corridor the way she always did, polishing the floor tiles, checking the window seals, straightening the bronze figurines on the credenza near the main staircase. Small things. Invisible things. The kind of work that only registers when it isn't done. She moved carefully. Her left side ached where the edge of the marble counter had caught her 2 days ago. She'd been carrying a tray of crystal glasses, and Saren had stepped into the corridor without warning, and when Amara lurched sideways to avoid collision, the counter had found her ribs with a precision that still made her breath catch when she reached too far. She hadn't told anyone. There was no one to tell. The house was quiet at this hour. That was the one mercy of the early shift. The absence of sound, the absence of attention, the ability to simply exist inside this place without being seen. She'd learned to love the dark hours of the morning the way you love something you know you can't keep. In 3 hours, the main house would begin to wake. In 4, Saren's personal alarm would sound, the one connected to her phone, the ringtone a delicate piano melody that Amara had come to associate with the particular tightening in her chest that preceded a bad day. Not every day was bad. That was the thing no one would believe if she ever tried to explain it. Some days, Saren barely acknowledged her existence, sweeping through the corridors in her silk robe with her attention fixed on her phone, leaving nothing in her wake but perfume and the faint tension of someone who had simply not yet found a reason to be angry. Those days, Amara worked fast and stayed out of sight and collected Nyla from the small room off the kitchen where the child spent her mornings with her picture books and her plastic animals and the small television Taehyun had personally ordered installed. Because he had said, on the day he learned Amara had no childcare and nowhere else to bring her daughter, that no woman under his roof should ever have to choose between her work and her child's safety. He had said it once, plainly, as a statement of policy rather than an act of generosity. Amara had stood in his study with her heart hammering so loud she thought he might hear it, waiting for the condition that didn't come. There wasn't one. She'd thought about that moment more times than she could count in the 8 months since. Thought about how a man capable of that simple, uncomplicated decency could be the same man whose name made other men lower their eyes. Thought about what it meant that the only person in this entire city who had offered her something without wanting something in return was Kang Tae-hyun. She didn't let herself think about it too long. That road led somewhere she couldn't afford to go. At 6:15, she heard Seirin's heels on the upper staircase. Early. 45 minutes early. Amara's hands stilled on the silver tray she was polishing. The sound of those heels had a grammar she had learned to read. The pace, the weight, the particular sharpness of each strike against stone. Fast and irregular meant agitated. Slow and measured meant performance, meant someone else was watching. What she heard now was fast, very fast. She set the tray down and straightened her posture and waited. Seirin appeared at the base of the stairs in a cream-colored wrap dress. Her dark hair pulled back tightly enough to make her face look younger and harder at the same time. She was 28 years old and genuinely, almost unfairly beautiful, with the kind of features that photographed well from every angle and a smile she could produce and withdraw with mechanical precision. She was already on her phone, speaking in a voice too low to carry, but whatever the conversation was, it had already lost. She stopped when she saw Amara. The phone call ended without a goodbye. "You're in the corridor," Seirin said. "I'm polishing the silver, Miss Yoon. I'll be out of your way." "I didn't ask what you were doing." Seirin walked forward slowly, the way someone walks toward something they're deciding whether to step on. "I asked why you're in the corridor." "This is part of my morning rotation, Miss Yoon." "Your rotation?" Seirin's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile. Something that wore the shape of one. "Do you know what Mr. Kang has scheduled this morning?" "I wasn't informed of a breakfast meeting. Here, in the main dining room, which you have not prepared." She tilted her head. "Explain that." Amara's jaw tightened. She knew what was on the morning schedule. She'd confirmed it with the head of household staff 2 days ago. Breakfast in the private dining room, not the main. A private meeting, 4 people, prepared by the kitchen staff under Chef Min's direction. She had not been assigned to the main dining room this morning because the main dining room was not in use. "The meeting is in the private dining room," Amara said carefully. "Chef Min is... Are you correcting me?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Amara looked at the floor. "No, Miss Yoon." "Because it sounds like you're correcting me." Seirin stepped closer. She smelled of expensive perfume and something underneath it that Amara had never been able to name. Something sharp, like metal before it heats. "It sounds like a servant is standing in Mr. Kang's corridor telling me I'm wrong about my own fiancé's schedule." "I'm not saying that." "Then what are you saying, Amara?" The way Seirin used her name was a specific thing. A weapon with no edge you could point to, no violence you could report. Just her name, in that voice, with that slight emphasis on the first syllable, like the name itself was something faintly ridiculous. "I'm saying I'll go check with Chef Min immediately." Amara reached for the silver tray. "Leave that." She left it. "And don't run. You're not in your neighborhood anymore." Amara walked to the kitchen without changing her pace. She was very good at not changing her pace. Chef Min, Park Min-jun, 53, who had worked for Taehyun for 6 years and had the permanent squint of someone who spent his life near open flames, confirmed what Amara already knew without looking up from the dough he was working. "Private dining room, 8 o'clock. You're not on the setup list, Johnson. Go back to your rotation." Miss Yoon said, "Miss Yoon isn't my employer." He finally looked up. Something passed across his face, not sympathy exactly, but the particular tired recognition of a man who had noticed things he'd made a professional decision not to involve himself in. Neither is she yours. Your employer is Mr. Kang. Go back to your rotation. She went back. The silver tray was still where she'd left it, but the cloth she'd been using had been moved, dropped on the floor. The tray had been turned sideways. Small things. Deniable things. The kind of thing you would feel insane for reporting and insane for not reporting. Amara picked up the cloth and finished the tray and didn't say anything to anyone. Nyla was awake by 7. Amara heard her before she reached the door, a murmuring sound, the child talking to her plastic animals in the particular serious tone she used when she was assigning them roles in whatever drama she had invented that morning. It was one of Amara's favorite sounds in the world, and she tried, every morning, to carry it with her into whatever came next. She pushed open the door, and Nyla looked up from the small rug where she'd arranged her animals in a circle facing outward, as if they were defending something. "Mommy." Not a question, just an acknowledgement, the way small children say the names of things they're certain of. "Hey, baby." Amara crouched down and pressed her lips to the top of Nyla's head, inhaling shea butter and the particular warmth of a child who has been sleeping soundly. "You hungry?" "Tiger isn't done yet," Nyla said, pointing to a small orange plastic tiger on the edge of the circle. "What's Tiger doing?" "Watching." Nyla said it with complete gravity. Amara looked at the circle of animals, at the tiger on the perimeter. She thought about that later, when she had the space to think. She thought about what a 3-year-old learns to do when the world around her starts to feel uncertain. She builds a circle, and she puts a watcher at the edge. "Tiger can watch while you eat," Amara said. "Come on." She carried Nyla to the kitchen on her hip. Her left hip, not her right, because the right side was the side that caught the counter, and Chef Min wordlessly slid a small bowl of rice congee onto the low counter where Nyla usually sat. He didn't say anything. He just did it and went back to his work, and that was the extent of the warmth available in this house most mornings, and Amara was grateful for it. Tae-hyun left for his first meeting at 7:45. Amara knew because she heard the motorcade, the low, heavy sound of the armored vehicles that were never formally described as armored, moving down the private drive. She allowed herself, briefly, a breath that went all the way to the bottom. The specific relief of his absence, not because he frightened her. He didn't, not in the way Saren did, but because his presence set the temperature of the house at a particular pitch, and his absence changed it in ways that cut both directions. When Tae-hyun was home, Saren performed. When Tae-hyun was gone, Saren stopped. It started at 9:17. Amara was on her knees in the west corridor, working a scuff mark out of the baseboard with a soft brush, when she heard Saren's voice behind her. "Stand up." She stood. Saren was holding a white linen napkin. She held it out toward Amara at arm's length, pinched between 2 fingers, the way you'd hold something contaminated. "Explain this." The napkin had a faint discoloration at one corner. A shadow, really. The ghost of something that might have once been a stain, laundered nearly to invisibility, but not quite. "That went through the standard laundry cycle," Amara said. "I can run it again with—" "You can run it again." Saren's voice was very quiet. That was the tell, when it went quiet. "These napkins were used at dinner last night. Mr. Kang's guests used these napkins, and you gave them linens with stains. It's barely visible. If you let me— barely visible." Saren let the napkin fall. It drifted to the floor between them. "Pick it up." Amara picked it up. "Not like that. On your knees." The corridor was empty. It was always empty when this happened. Amara looked at her, held the look for 1 full second longer than was safe. Then she crouched and picked the napkin up off the floor and rose again and kept her face at exactly neutral, which was a skill she had developed over 8 months the way some people develop other survival skills, through pure repetition and the absence of any alternative. "You think Mr. Kang would tolerate this if he knew?" Saren walked a slow half-circle around her, not touching, never touching, in daylight, in a room that might retain memory of it. "Do you think he doesn't have standards? Do you think he brought you here because he was running low on options?" "I perform my duties. You perform the minimum, and you know it." Saren stopped in front of her. "I've seen the way you move through this house, like you belong here. Like someone invited you. A pause precisely calculated. Your staff, Amara. Your seasonal staff. Do you understand what that means? It means when I become Mrs. Kang, the first thing I do is review every contract in this building. Amara said nothing. I'm speaking to you. I understand, Miss Yoon. Saren tilted her head, studying her the way a person studies something they can afford to be slow about. Your daughter, Nyla. The name in her mouth was a different thing than when Tae-hyun said it. Something that registered below the surface, in the part of the body that responds to threat before the mind catches up. She's sweet. Children that age are so impressionable. It matters, the environment they grow up in, don't you think? The corridor was very cold. Yes, Amara said. Her voice was steady. It had taken her a long time to make it steady. Good. Saren smiled. Then we understand each other. She reached out and took the stained napkin from Amara's hand. Clean this house, Amara, all of it. I want every surface in the East Wing done before Mr. Kang returns. If I find anything below standard, I'll make note of it for his review. She walked away without another word. Amara stood in the corridor for exactly 4 seconds. Then she got her supplies and started on the East Wing. It took her until noon to finish. She was working on the last room, a small sitting room near the secondary staircase, rarely used, that smelled of old paper and cedar, when she heard Nyla's voice from down the hall. Not crying, just talking. The high, piping, conversational tone of a child who doesn't yet know when to be quiet. Then she heard Saren's voice cut across it like a blade. She dropped the cloth and moved. The hallway outside the kitchen was a short stretch of pale stone, and when Amara rounded the corner, she found Nyla standing very still near the opposite wall, holding her plastic tiger in both hands, looking up at Saren with the expression children wear when they have understood that something is wrong but don't yet have the vocabulary for what kind of wrong it is. Saren was looking down at the child with something on her face that she didn't bother to control when she thought no adults were watching. Not anger exactly. Something more dispassionate than anger. The expression of someone who has simply decided that a thing should not exist in their vicinity. She wandered out, Saren said without turning to look at Amara. Keep her contained. I don't want her loose in the house. She's 3. The words came out before the calculation. A mistake. A very small one, but a mistake. Saren turned. What did you say? Amara looked at Nyla first. Go back to your room, baby. Take Tiger with you. Nyla didn't move. She was still watching Saren with that ancient, unreadable child focus. Nyla? Amara's voice went softer. Go ahead. The child went, slowly, backward for the first few steps, keeping her eyes on Saren until she turned the corner. She's 3, Saren repeated, in a tone that had nothing to do with agreement. And you think that means she can go wherever she wants in this house? She knows her boundaries. She was probably looking for me. She's your responsibility. That means her behavior is your responsibility. And your behavior, Saren stepped forward, is apparently something that requires regular reminding. I understand. No, you don't understand or we wouldn't keep having this conversation. Saren reached out and took Amara's wrist. Not hard. That was the sophisticated part. Not hard enough to leave a mark, not yet. Just hard enough to establish the hierarchy of the gesture. The particular communication of a hand that has decided it has the right to touch. You work in my house, Saren said. This will be my house. You're here because Mr. Kang has certain ideas about staff welfare that I will be reviewing after the wedding. Until that happens, your position here depends entirely on my satisfaction. Is that clear? Amara looked at the hand on her wrist. Is that clear, Amara? Yes. Saren released her, smoothed her dress, walked away. Amara stood in the hallway for a moment with the sensation of the grip still on her skin, like something that had pressed itself into her circulation. Then she went to find Nyla. Nyla was back in her room, seated in the center of her animal circle with the tiger in her lap. She'd added more animals to the perimeter since morning. The circle was larger now. Amara sat on the floor beside her. You okay, baby? Nyla considered the question with the seriousness she gave most things. The lady doesn't like me, she said finally. She's just busy, Amara said. The lie tasted exactly like what it was. She looks at me like I'm dirty. Nyla said it simply, the way children say true things. Without performance, without softening, just the clean, bare fact of it. Amara's throat closed. "You're not dirty," she said. "You hear me? You are not dirty. You are—" She stopped, pressed her palm flat against Nyla's cheek. "You are the best thing that ever happened in this world, okay? That's just true." Nyla leaned her head into Amara's hand. "Okay, Mommy." They sat there for a while. The animal circle held. The tiger watched the door. 3 weeks before Amara had taken this job, she'd been sleeping on an air mattress in her cousin Diane's spare room in Itaewon with Nyla between her and the wall, counting the money she had left, which was not enough money, not nearly, and trying to figure out which of the two available bad options was less bad. She'd come to Seoul 18 months ago following a man who had seemed, in Atlanta, like someone worth following. That assessment turned out to be wrong in ways that were slow to reveal themselves and fast to become dangerous. And by the time she understood the full shape of what she'd walked into, she'd already used the last of her savings on a security deposit for an apartment that turned out to be in his name. When she left, finally, with Nyla in her arms and a single bag and the particular clarity that comes after you've made a decision that cannot be reversed, she had nothing except herself and the child, and a stubborn piece of her that had not yet decided to stop. The job at the Kang estate had come through a placement agency that specialized in high-end household staff. The pay was exceptional. The requirements were strict. She'd been interviewed 3 times, background checked twice, and then called into a final meeting with the estate's head of household, a composed woman in her 50s named Mrs. O, who looked at her across a desk and said, "Mr. Kang runs this house the way he runs his businesses. Precision, discretion, loyalty. You will not be asked to perform tasks outside your role. You will not be asked questions about his personal life, and you will not volunteer information about your own. What happens in this house stays in this house. If you are comfortable with those terms, the position is available." Amara had said yes before the sentence finished. She hadn't known then what the Kang name meant beyond the obvious: wealth, influence, the particular social gravity that pooled around old money and new power alike in this city. She'd found out later, in pieces, the way information like that tends to travel. A comment from Chef Maid, a careful non-answer from one of the other staff members. A news article she'd read on her phone late one night that was light on specifics and heavy on implication. She'd sat with it, turned it over, thought about Nyla's air mattress in Diane's spare room, thought about the education fund she was building contribution by contribution toward a nursing degree she'd deferred twice and wasn't sure she still wanted. Thought about what it meant to have no good options, only different kinds of complicated ones. She'd stayed. The bruises from that first grip, Saren's hand on her wrist that afternoon, faded within 4 days. The ones that came a week later took longer. It had been a Tuesday, one of Taehyun's longer absences, a trip to Tokyo that had extended by 2 days due to something no one in the house discussed aloud. Saren's mood, already volatile, had compressed into something dense and particular, the kind of pressure that builds in a contained space when the thing regulating it is temporarily absent. Amara had been in the library, returning a set of books to the shelf in the order Mrs. O had specified. There was a specific order, catalogued and precise, when Saren came through the door and stopped in the middle of the room and looked at her. "You organized these wrong," she said. Amara looked at the shelf. The books were correctly ordered. She had followed the catalog exactly. "I followed Mrs. O's system," she said. "Mrs. O is not in charge of this library anymore." Saren walked to the shelf and pulled 3 books out and let them drop to the floor. "Now they're wrong. Fix them." Amara crouched and picked up the books. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady now. She'd noticed this about herself, the way her extremities had learned composure before the rest of her. "Put them back in the right order," Saren said. "Could you tell me which order you'd prefer?" "The one that makes sense." Amara looked at the empty spaces in the shelf. She began to place the books back in the order they'd been in. "Not that order." Saren's voice sharpened. "Did I say that order?" "You haven't specified, Maid." "I shouldn't have to specify. If you were competent, you would know." There was a logic to it. If you stood outside it and looked, the impossibility was the point. There was no correct answer because the correct answer was not the objective. The objective was the demonstration. The establishment, repeated and varied, of who held power in this particular cubic footage of the world. Amara understood this with clarity. Understanding it did not help. "Try again," Saren said. She tried again. Wrong. She tried a third time. Saren reached past her and took her arm, above the elbow this time, her fingers wrapping fully around the muscle, and squeezed. Not briefly. For 3 full seconds, long enough to feel the blood change in her forearm, long enough that when Saren released her and walked out, the shape of each finger was still there, pressed into her skin like a question. The following morning, in the fluorescent half-light of the staff bathroom, Amara had looked at her arm. 4 parallel marks already purpling, thumbprint on the inside, distinct and inarguable. She'd looked at them for a long time. Then she'd put her sleeve down and gone to work. She told herself what she always told herself. Not yet. She didn't have enough saved. She didn't have a place to go that was better than this place. She didn't have the nursing degree finished. She didn't have enough. When she had enough, she would go. She just needed more time. The math had seemed clean 3 weeks ago. It was getting harder to trust the math. The night Tae-hyun came home from Tokyo, the house recalibrated. It was like watching a system come back online. The staff moved slightly differently, spoke slightly more precisely, carried themselves with the particular alertness that a high-functioning house develops around a high-functioning employer. Chef Min started a second round of preparation without being asked. Mrs. O did a walkthrough of the main rooms at 6. The security team ran its check 20 minutes early. And Saren walked into the foyer in a pale blue dress with her hair down and her smile at its most practiced. And when Tae-hyun came through the door, she moved into his space with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the choreography of intimacy until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. "You look tired," she said, her hand on his arm. "I'll have Min make your preferred tea." Tae-hyun nodded. He was tired. It was visible in the set of his shoulders, the slight dragging quality of his movements, despite the controlled posture he maintained as default. He was a tall man with the particular physical economy of someone who had been dangerous for so long it had become architectural. He didn't move like someone performing authority. He moved like someone who had never had to consider whether they had any. He looked up and saw Amara in the corridor, carrying a stack of fresh linens toward the upper level. "Mrs. Johnson," he said. "Mr. Kang, welcome back." He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than the exchange required. Just 1 second. Then he followed Saren toward the sitting room, and Amara went up the stairs and the house settled around them all like a structure that was holding more weight than it had been designed for and had not yet decided to show the strain. Bleh. 3 days after his return, Tae-hyun called a household meeting. These happened quarterly, a brief formal gathering of all staff in the main dining room, where Tae-hyun or Mrs. O would outline any changes in schedule, standards, or household policy. Amara had attended 3 of them. They were efficiently run and notable primarily for the specificity of his attention. He actually looked at each person when he spoke, which was rarer than it should have been in this city or any other. He spoke for 11 minutes. Schedule updates. A note about the upcoming engagement dinner requiring additional preparation. A reminder about discretion protocols during the event. Then he paused. "One additional item," he said. He was looking at the room generally, not at any one person. "I've been informed that some aspects of household management have shifted recently. If any staff member has concerns about their working conditions or treatment, those concerns can be brought to Mrs. O or directly to me. This is not optional. It is a requirement." He paused again, briefly. "This household operates by one set of rules. My rules. Not whoever happens to be in the building when I'm not." The room was very quiet. Amara kept her eyes on the table in front of her, and her hands folded in her lap, and her breath at the exact depth required to maintain composure. Beside her, she felt the minute shift of Chef Min's weight, the barely there adjustment of someone who has just heard something that confirms a suspicion they'd spent months avoiding. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at Seirin, who was standing at the edge of the room with her smile precisely in place and nothing behind it. After the meeting, Amara went to collect Nyla from her room. Nyla had added a new animal to her circle, a a small plastic horse placed between the tiger and the edge of the rug. "What's the horse for?" Amara asked. Nyla considered. "In case Tiger gets tired," she said. That night, alone on her cot after Neela was asleep, Amara lay in the dark and thought about the meeting, about the specific thing Taehyun had said, about the fact that he had said it at all. She thought about what it would cost to tell him. She thought about what it would cost not to. She was still thinking when dawn came, and Nyla stirred, and the day started again. The engagement dinner was 12 days away when Se-rin found the broken vase. It wasn't a significant vase, or rather, it wasn't one Amara had broken. She had noticed it 2 days prior, a crack running along the base of a pale celadon piece on the shelf in the secondary sitting room, and had reported it to Mrs. O, who had noted it in the damage log with a timestamp. The log existed precisely for moments like this. Se-rin seemed to have forgotten, or decided to forget, that the log existed. She called Amara into the sitting room at 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, when the house was quiet and Nyla was napping, and the daylight through the western windows made everything look calm and clean and false. The vase was on the table in front of her, the crack visible. "How did this happen?" Se-rin asked. "I reported that to Mrs. O on Monday," Amara said. "It's in the damage log. The crack was pre-existing when I—" "You reported it to cover yourself." "I reported it because that's the protocol." "Don't use that tone with me." Se-rin stood up. "This vase belonged to Mr. Kang's mother. It has specific sentimental value that you, obviously, would have no way of understanding. I didn't damage it. There's a timestamp on the log entry from—" "I don't care about your log." Se-rin's voice was escalating, not loudly. She was always careful about volume, but in that compressed, rising way that Amara had learned to read as a specific kind of warning. "I care about the fact that you have been careless with property in this house since you arrived, and I am tired of making excuses for you to Mr. Kang. You've never mentioned me to Mr. Kang in connection with any—" Se-rin crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed Amara's arm. Same arm, same placed above the elbow, but harder this time. The fingers locked in with a force that went past communication into something else, something that sent a white light up through Amara's shoulder and into the back of her jaw. "You don't know what I tell Mr. Kang," Se-rin said. Her face was very close, her voice was very quiet. "You don't know anything about what happens between us. You are a maid. You clean floors. And when I become Mrs. Kang—" She tightened her grip, and Amara felt the muscle compress. "You will not be here. I can promise you that." The door to the sitting room was open. Nyla was in the hallway. She hadn't been napping. She was standing in the doorway in her socks with her tiger in one hand, her eyes moving between her mother and the woman holding her mother's arm with the focused, unblinking attention of a child who is recording everything because she does not yet know that what she's seeing is something she'll have to carry. Se-rin saw her, released Amara's arm immediately, smoothed her dress. "Close the door," she said calmly. Amara walked to her daughter and crouched down, and Nyla put her arms around her neck, and Amara held her for a moment, just a moment, with her back to Se-rin and her face pressed into her daughter's hair, and felt the trembling move through her own hands. Not fear, not exactly, but the particular physical expression of a person who has reached the end of what they can absorb without letting it show. "Go to your room, baby," she whispered. Nyla tightened her grip. "Nyla." Amara pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. Neela's eyes were dry. She was not crying. She was watching her mother with the same focused, unblinking attention she'd turned on Se-rin, and in it Amara saw something that she would not be able to name for several days, but that settled into her chest like a stone. Her daughter was already learning to watch. She was 3 years old, and she was already learning to watch. "Go ahead," Amara said quietly. "I'll be right there." Nyla went. Amara stood up, turned around, and looked at Se-rin. "That's all," Se-rin said. "You can go." Amara went. In the hallway, she pulled up her sleeve. The marks were already visible. Not the same faded shadows she'd spent weeks dismissing as accidental. Defined, deliberate. The exact geometry of someone's hand pressed into her skin like a signature. She stood there for a moment, just stood there. Then she lowered her sleeve and went to her daughter's room and sat on the floor inside the circle of animals and held Nyla against her side and felt the decision she'd been postponing for months solidify into something she could almost hold. Almost. Not yet. She told herself, not yet. But the math was running out, and from the corner of the room, from its position at the edge of the circle, the plastic tiger watched the door. Amara did not sleep that night either. She lay in the dark with Nyla pressed against her side, and the marks on her arm throbbing with the specific patient insistence of an injury that refuses to be ignored. And she ran the numbers. She had been running the numbers since the beginning. It was how she'd survived every bad situation that preceded this one. The cold arithmetic of what she had versus what she needed. The careful management of time as a resource. But tonight the numbers weren't cooperating. Savings. Enough for 3 months in a modest place if she found something immediately. Nursing program. 11 months from completion if she maintained her current enrollment, which required the income from this position to cover tuition. Nyla's routine, stable for the first time in 2 years. Nyla's pediatric appointments, covered under the household health provision. Taehyun extended to all full-time staff, which she would lose the day she left. She'd built a structure. It was a structure with a serious flaw in it, the flaw being that it required her to continue standing inside a burning building, but it was the best structure she'd been able to engineer from the materials available, and dismantling it without a replacement meant she and Nyla were back to the air mattress in Diane's spare room. And Diane had a new boyfriend and a smaller apartment and had mentioned twice in the past month, gently but with precision, that the arrangement was becoming complicated. She stared at the ceiling, the water stain that looked like a hand, the thing she hadn't let herself think about, the things she'd been managing around, the way you manage around structural damage in a house you can't afford to leave, was Nyla's face in the doorway that afternoon. The stillness of her, the quality of attention in a 3-year-old's eyes that should not be that focused, that should not carry that weight. Amara had been telling herself for months that she was protecting her daughter by staying, that the stability, the health coverage, the income, the room where Nyla had her rug and her animals and her small television, that these things added up to protection, that Nyla was too young to understand what she was seeing, that it was passing over her. She understood, lying in the dark, that she had been wrong about that. A child builds a circle and puts a watcher at the edge. A child stops laughing when a particular set of footsteps sounds in the corridor. A child holds on too long when her mother comes to find her. The math, she thought, had been the wrong math all along. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. Chit. Morning came gray and cold, a front moving in off the coast that flattened the sky over Seoul into a single sheet of hammered pewter. Amara dressed before dawn, left Nyla sleeping, and was in the east corridor by 5 with her supplies. Her arm ached when she reached overhead. She worked through it. At 6:30, Mrs. O found her in the corridor. Mrs. O was not a person who sought people out without a reason. She was precise and economical in her movements and her communications both, and in the 10 months Amara had worked under her, she had never once initiated a conversation that wasn't operationally necessary. She stood in the corridor now in her immaculate charcoal suit and looked at Amara with an expression that gave very little away but gave enough. "You filed the damage report on Monday," Mrs. O said, "the Celadon piece." "Yes. I've pulled it from the log, time-stamped, clearly pre-existing damage." A pause. "For the record?" Amara looked at her. "Thank you." Mrs. O held her gaze for a moment. "How are your working conditions, Mrs. Johnson?" The question was asked with complete neutrality, in the same tone she might ask about supply inventory or the cleanliness of the guest bath. But it was the question Taehyun had instructed staff to be asked. It was the question from the meeting. And Mrs. O asking it now, at 6:30 in the morning, in a corridor where they were alone, meant that something had filtered upward that wasn't supposed to. Amara thought about Nyla's face in the doorway. "Fine," she said. Mrs. O looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded once, with the precise economy of someone who has heard what was said and also what wasn't, and walked away. Amara stood in the corridor after she left and felt something twist in her chest. The specific pain of a door she could have walked through and had chosen, again, to close. The engagement dinner preparations consumed the next 4 days. Additional catering staff were brought in. Florists arrived with an installation that required 6 hours and a team of 4, and the main reception hall, which Amara had only seen empty, was transformed into something that belonged in a different category of reality from the rest of her life. Long tables with settings that cost more per place than her monthly grocery budget, lighting rigs that turned the room a warm amber that erased every shadow, flower arrangements so elaborate they required structural supports hidden within them. Saren was present for all of it, directing with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this particular production for years. She was charming with the vendors, specific and knowledgeable about every aesthetic decision, capable of a warmth in public-facing context that would make Amara's account of the past 10 months sound unhinged if she ever tried to report it to anyone who had only seen this version of her. That was the sophisticated part. The part that had taken Amara longest to understand. Saren was not careless. She was very, very careful about who she allowed to see what, and the version she showed to Tae-hyun and to the world was consistent and polished, and specifically calibrated to produce exactly the response it produced: trust, admiration, the assumption of goodness. The version she showed to Amara required an empty room and a closed door. During those 4 days, with the house full of strangers and activity, Saren largely ignored her. Not peace, you couldn't call it peace, but a suspension, the way a storm suspends when the pressure system shifts. Amara moved through the preparations with the professional efficiency that had made her indispensable here and tried not to calculate how many days were left before the wedding and what came after. Nyla, meanwhile, had become quieter. Not sad, exactly. More careful. She played with her animals with the same seriousness but spoke to them less. She watched the door more. When the additional staff moved through the house, strangers in unfamiliar uniforms, she tracked them with her eyes without approaching. At night, she asked Amara, "Are we going to stay here?" Amara said, "For now, baby." Nyla said, "Okay." Then, after a pause, "Tiger wants to stay too." Amara looked at the tiger on the pillow beside her daughter's head. "Tiger stays," she said. On the 5th day after Tokyo, Kang Tae-hyun did not go to his morning meetings. Amara didn't know this until she was in the upper corridor at 7:15 with a cart of fresh linens, moving between guest rooms, and heard his voice behind her. Not raised, not anything close to raised, but close enough that she turned. He was standing outside the door to his private study, phone in hand, speaking in Korean in a tone that she had learned to identify as controlled anger, the particular compression of a voice that is managing its own force the way a hand manages a blade. She caught fragments without trying to, a name, repeated, a number she didn't recognize. Then a silence while he listened, and then a response that was 3 words, short and final, and the call ended. He looked up and found her standing there with her cart. "Sorry," she said, moving to step past. "I'll come back." "You're fine." He pocketed the phone. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical, the particular tired of someone carrying information they cannot distribute. "Continue your work." She moved past him toward the first guest room. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Mrs. Johnson." She stopped. "How long have you been with the household?" She turned. 10 months next week." He nodded slowly. He was looking at her, not the way Saren looked at her, nothing clinical about it, but with a focused attention that she associated with his professional reputation, the way she'd heard people describe him. He looks at a problem the way a surgeon looks at an incision site. "Your daughter," he said. "Nyla." "Yes." "She's well?" Something tightened in her throat. A very small thing. "She's well, thank you for asking." He held the look for a moment longer. "If anything in your working conditions requires my attention," he said, "Mrs. O has my standing instruction to bring it forward." She thought about Mrs. O in the corridor that morning, the question asked and the answer not given. "I understand," she said. He nodded once and went back into his study. She went into the guest room and stood with her back against the closed door for a moment, breathing. The linens were in her arms. The door was solid. Outside, nothing had changed. The house was the same house it had been 5 minutes ago, and yet something in the arrangement of pressure inside her chest felt different, fractionally, in a way she couldn't quite account for. She made the bed. She moved to the next room. She did not go to Mrs. O. The night before the engagement dinner, Saren came to her room. Not the staff quarters, the small room off the kitchen where Nyla spent her days. Neela was already asleep. It was 9:40 in the evening, and the house had quieted after the last of the catering setup, and Amara was sitting on the edge of Nyla's cot working through a chapter of her nursing textbook by the light of her phone when the door opened without a knock. Saren stood in the doorway in a silk robe, her hair loose, her face stripped of its public-facing expression. This was the version Amara knew, the one without the calibration. She looked at the cot, at Nyla sleeping, at Amara's textbook. "Studying," she said. A statement, not a question. "Yes." "For what?" "Nursing program." Amara kept her voice even. "Correspondence enrollment." Saren tilted her head. Something moved across her face. Not quite amusement, not quite contempt, but the specific overlap between the two that people produce when they encounter ambition in someone they've decided does not merit it. "A nurse," she said. "That's the plan. Ambitious." She leaned against the doorframe. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clearly." She looked at Amara directly. "After tomorrow, this house is mine. Not officially, not legally. The wedding is still weeks away. But functionally, it will be mine. Mr. Kong trusts my management of the household entirely." Amara said nothing. "The staff contracts that come up for renewal in the next quarter. Yours is on that list. I've already drafted notes on each position." A pause. "Yours is not favorable." "I see." "You should start thinking about other options. There are agencies that place domestic staff in less demanding environments. I can provide a reference that accurately reflects your time here, or I can provide one that doesn't." The offer hung in the air. The architecture of it was clear. Leave quietly, receive a usable reference. Stay, receive the other kind. It was, Amara thought, the most direct Saren had ever been with her, which meant something. Either she was more confident than she'd ever been, or she was more impatient. Probably both. Amara looked at Neela sleeping, at the tiger on the pillow. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. Saren waited, as if expecting something else. Then she pushed off the doorframe. "Tomorrow runs perfectly," she said. "Every surface, every room, every arrangement. Don't give me a reason to note an incident." She left without closing the door. Amara reached out and closed it herself quietly and sat for a moment in the dark with her textbook in her lap and the specific sensation of walls closing with great patience and precision from multiple directions. She looked at her nursing chapter. Cellular biology. She'd underlined a passage 3 weeks ago. The body's immune response does not distinguish between threats. It only distinguishes between self and not self, and when it gets that distinction wrong, the damage is indiscriminate. She closed the book. She lay down beside Nyla and put her arm around her daughter and felt the child's breathing, steady and deep and entirely unconcerned with cellular biology or nursing textbooks or the architecture of careful, deniable harm. "I'm going to fix this," she said into her daughter's hair. Barely a sound, less than a whisper, something between a promise and an admission. Nyla slept. The engagement dinner was, by any observable measure, a success. 42 guests, the constellation of Seoul's elite, business, politics, media, and the careful borderland between all three where the most interesting power actually moved. Tae-hyun at the head of the table in a dark suit that cost more than Amara's nursing program, and wore it with the ease of someone who had stopped thinking about clothes around the same time he stopped thinking about which fork to use. Saren beside him in ivory silk, radiant, precise. Every gesture a performance of the intimacy she wanted witnessed. Amara worked the edges of the event with 3 additional staff, moving trays and plates and glasses in the practiced near invisibility that formal events require from the people who make them possible. She was in the room for most of it. She watched. She watched Saren touch Tae-hyun's arm and say something that made the table laugh. She watched him respond, not warmly, exactly, but with a tolerance that looked, at this distance and in this light, like affection. She watched the assembled power of the city receive them as a unit, as a pairing, as the next version of what a particular dynasty looks like when it continues into another generation. She watched him, at one point, scan the room in the brief, systematic way she'd noticed he did in any space where he was responsible for what happened. checking the perimeter, the exits, the faces of his staff, the things that didn't fit. His eyes moved across her and stopped for a fraction of a second and moved on. She kept her face at neutral. She carried her tray to the next table. It was after midnight when the guests left and the additional staff had been dismissed and the main house had been locked down. Amara was in the reception hall with the last of the clearing work, 3 hours of effort visible in her body as a particular heaviness that lived now in her lower back and both shoulders. She'd sent Nyla to sleep hours ago. Nyla had gone without complaint, which meant she was more tired than she was letting on, which Amara filed as another data point in the ongoing record she kept of what this place was costing her daughter. She was stacking the last of the serving trays near the kitchen door when she heard heels on the stone floor behind her. She didn't need to turn to know. "You missed a table," Saren said. She turned. The room behind her was clear. She had been methodical. "Which table?" "The one by the east window. The arrangement is off-center. You moved it during service." "The florist placed that arrangement. I didn't adjust it during service." "I watched you adjust it." The room was empty except for them. The lights had been dimmed after the guests left. In the low amber light, Saren looked like the version of herself the dinner had shown the world. Polished, certain, entirely in possession of whatever space she occupied. "The table is clear," Amara said. "My work here is done. I'll collect Nyla and fix the arrangement first." She looked at the table by the east window. The floral arrangement was centered. She could see it from here. She walked to the table. She put her hands on the arrangement and shifted it 1 inch to the left and stepped back. "Not that way." Saren crossed the room. "The other way." Amara shifted it back. "You moved it too far." There was no correct position. She knew that. She moved it a third time, splitting the difference, and stood back. Saren reached past her and took the arrangement in both hands and lifted it and set it down with a force that wasn't quite violence, but wasn't not violence either. Enough to shift the water in the vase, enough to scatter 3 or 4 petals across the tablecloth. "Now it's wrong," Saren said. "Miss Yoon, clean it up." Amara gathered the petals. Her hands were steady. They were always steady now, and she had stopped taking that as a good sign. "You know," Saren said, "I've been trying to understand what it is about you that Mr. Kang finds so significant. You're a competent maid. You're not remarkable in any way I can identify. You have a child you brought into this house as a condition of your employment, which is an unusual concession that he made once, and that I have been dealing with the consequences of ever since." She was looking at Amar's hands on the petals. "And yet he asks about you. He mentions you specifically, when no one has brought you up." A pause. "That's interesting to me." Amara didn't respond. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "No," Amara said, which was a lie. "I think you do." Saren stepped closer. "And I want you to understand something in return. Whatever you think that interest means, whatever you've let yourself imagine about your position in this house or the security it represents, I want you to dismantle that completely. Because when I tell you that you won't be here after the wedding, I mean it with absolute specificity." The petals were gathered. There was nothing more to do. Amara straightened up. And something, not courage, not precisely, more like the end of the capacity to absorb, moved through her. "Why do you hate me?" she asked. Just that, flat and direct, with no calculation behind it. Saren blinked, just once, as if the directness had briefly interrupted the performance. "I don't hate you," she said. "You're not worth the energy." "Then why?" Amara held her eyes. "Every day, in an empty room, when no one's watching. Why?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Because you look at him like he's a person," Saren said. And then, as if she'd revealed something she hadn't intended to, her face closed again. "Go to bed, Amara. We're done here." Amara left the reception hall. She walked the long corridor to the staff quarters, and she sat on her cot in the dark with that sentence running through her mind. "Because you look at him like he's a person." And she thought about what it meant, and what it cost to have said it, and what it told her about the woman who had said it, and the man who was about to marry her. She sat there for a long time. Then she made a decision. Not the decision she'd been delaying for months. A smaller one, preceding it, the one that would determine whether the larger one was ever possible. Tomorrow, she thought, she would talk to Mrs. O tomorrow. She would do it properly, with the damage log pulled up and the timestamps visible and her sleeve rolled to the elbow. She would stop running the wrong math. She lay down beside Nyla. She closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she slept. She did not know that she would not get to tomorrow first. The next morning, everything changed. Not in the way she'd planned. Not with a conversation in Mrs. O's office or a carefully documented report or any of the controlled, careful processes she'd spent the night convincing herself were available to her. It changed the way things change in a life like hers. Without preparation, without the courtesy of the version you'd rehearsed, Saren had been on a call with her mother since 7 in the morning. Amara knew this because the sound traveled. Saren's voice, normally so controlled, running at a register and pace that indicated the conversation was not going the way she wanted. Something about the family finances. Something about obligations that predated the engagement. Something that Amara caught in fragments, without trying to, and understood only partially, but enough to read the temperature. Saren was being reminded of something she owed, and she resented it with the specific heat of someone who has agreed to a cost, and is only now calculating what pain it actually feels like. The call ended at 9:40. The household staff had largely been dismissed for the morning, the day after a major event, reduced crew. The regular staff handling only the essential work, while the additional people who'd been brought in for the dinner rotated out. Amara had stayed. She was always the last to leave and the first to arrive, a pattern that had developed not from instruction, but from the particular logic of her situation. She had nowhere else to be, and being here was, for now, better than the alternative. She was in the banquet hall, alone, setting the last of the restored arrangements back into their positions after the post-dinner cleaning, the room large and quiet, and still holding the ghost of last night's light, even in the flat gray morning. She could hear the city outside the high windows, traffic, a helicopter, the low urban hum of a place that does not pause. She heard the heels before she heard anything else. Fast. Very fast. She turned. Saren was in the doorway in what she'd been wearing for the call. A pale dress, her hair back, her face carrying the specific expression of someone who has taken a very large amount of energy from one source and needs to put it somewhere else immediately. She crossed the room without speaking. Amara held her position. She thought, I am going to Mrs. O today. She thought, I made a decision last night. She thought, in the half-second before anything else happened, I have a plan. Saren reached the long service table along the east wall and picked up the crystal pitcher that had been left from the dinner setup, tall, heavy, still half full of water from the night before, the ice long since melted into cold. And before Amara could speak, before she could move, before the plan or the decision or the math she'd been running for months could intervene in any way at all, Saren lifted the pitcher and poured it. The cold hit her like a physical blow. All of it at once, her head, her shoulders, her uniform, the water running into her collar and down her back and soaking through to her skin in the first second with a cold so immediate and complete it stopped her breath in her chest. She gasped. It was involuntary, pure physical response, the body protesting what the mind was still catching up to. On your knees, Saren said. Her voice was very quiet. Amara was soaked to the skin. The water was dripping from her braids onto the marble floor, a steady sound, precise and small, in the enormous quiet of the empty room. I said on your knees. She didn't move. Saren stepped toward her. I will call Mr. Kang right now and tell him you threatened me. I will tell him you raised your hand to me. I will tell him whatever I need to tell him, and he will believe me, because he has never once had a reason to. The door to the banquet hall opened. Not slowly, with the particular energy of a door opened by someone who moves with purpose and has not been told there is any reason not to. Kang Tae-hyun walked into the room. He stopped. The scene arranged itself in front of him with the economy of a situation that requires no interpretation. His fiancée, standing over a soaked and trembling woman in a ruined uniform, the crystal pitcher still in her hand, the water spreading across the marble floor in a slow, inevitable circle. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then something small and fast came across the room, across the full width of the banquet hall, from the doorway where she had apparently been standing, where no one had seen her because no one had looked, and hit Tae-hyun at knee height with a force entirely disproportionate to her size. Nyla, 3 years old, in her socks, her plastic tiger in one fist, her other arm wrapped around Tae-hyun's leg, with a grip that communicated, with the complete physical honesty of a child who has not yet learned to be strategic about the truth, that she had been waiting for someone she trusted to come through that door. Tae-hyun looked down at her. Nyla looked up at him. She raised her free hand, the one not holding the tiger, and pointed directly at Seirin. Her finger was steady. Her voice, when it came, was very small and very clear in the enormous quiet of the room. She hurts Mommy. A pause. Just a breath. Every day. The water was still dripping from Amar's braids. That was the detail that stayed. Not the crystal pitcher still hanging from Seirin's hand, not the spreading pool on the marble floor, not even the child wrapped around his leg like something that had decided he was the only solid thing in the room. Just the sound of water hitting marble in a slow, metronomic drip, and the fact that no one moved to stop it. Tae-hyun stood in the doorway of his own banquet hall and looked at the scene in front of him the way he looked at everything that required a decision, completely, without the interference of expression, cataloging what was there before he allowed himself to respond to any of it. Amara. Soaked through, her uniform ruined, her braids plastered against her neck and shoulders, standing with her spine straight in a way that looked like it was costing her something significant. Her hands were at her sides, not shaking, which told him more than the shaking would have. Seirin. 3 meters away, the pitcher in her right hand, still at the angle of someone who had just finished a motion. Her face doing the thing it did when it was recalibrating, the micro shift between one expression and the next, the fraction of a second where the performance changed costumes. She was moving toward composed. She was almost there. Almost. And at his knee, Nyla, whose grip had not loosened, whose arm was still around his leg with the particular force of a small body that has been waiting a long time to hold on to something. He looked down at her. She was still pointing, her finger, small and certain, aimed directly at Seirin across the width of the room. "She hurts Mommy," she had said. Every day. 7 words. The grammar of someone who hasn't yet learned to soften truth for the comfort of the people receiving it. No hedging, no qualification, no reading of the room, just the fact, delivered with the complete conviction of a witness who had been watching for months and had simply been waiting for someone worth telling. Tae-hyun reached down and put his hand on top of Nyla's head. A brief, deliberate contact. Then he straightened. "Put that down," he said to Seirin. His voice was the same volume it always was. That was the thing people who hadn't been in a room with him when he was genuinely angry sometimes failed to understand. The volume didn't change. The temperature did. Seirin set the pitcher on the table beside her. The sound it made was too loud in the quiet room. "Tae-hyun, this isn't—" "I didn't ask you to explain yet." Seirin's mouth closed. He crossed the room to Amara. Not fast, not slow. The pace of someone who has made a calculation and is executing it. He stopped in front of her and looked at her face, which was doing what her hands were doing, holding. Just holding, at great cost, the expression of someone who has decided they will not perform distress for an audience, regardless of how much distress is actually present. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I'm fine." The answer came out immediately, reflexively, the way a person answers who has spent months training themselves to give that answer. "That's not what I asked." A pause. A breath. Something moved across her face. Not breaking, not quite, but flexing. "I'm cold," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said in this house in months, and something about the simplicity of it, the smallness of it, landed in the room with more weight than anything else could have. He turned. Seirin had recomposed. She was standing with her hands clasped in front of her chin at the angle she used in rooms full of people who were looking at her. Her expression calibrated to communicate injured reasonableness. The look of someone who has been misunderstood and is choosing patience in the face of it. "There's a context here," she said. "I know how this looks, but there's a context you don't have." "There's always a context," Tae-hyun said. She was refusing a direct request. "She's been insubordinate since you what?" The question was very quiet. Saren stopped. Since you what, Saren? The room held the question. The water was still dripping. Nyla had moved. Amara had pulled her in, the child now pressed against her mother's wet side, her tiger still in her fist, watching Sayreen with the focused, unblinking attention of a small creature that has learned to track something dangerous. This is a household matter, Saren said, and her voice had found its register again. Steady, slightly wounded, the voice she used when she needed him to hear reasonableness. I handle the staff you've always trusted me to handle. Show me your arm. Amara's body went still. What? Saren said. Your arm. He looked at Amara. Your arm. Show me. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Amara reached up with her right hand and took the cuff of her left sleeve and pushed it back. The bruising was not subtle. It had not faded. Above the elbow, 4 parallel marks and a thumbprint, yellowish at the edges and deep purple at the center. The geometry of a grip applied with intent and held long enough to leave something permanent. Taehyun looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. He did not look at Sayreen. How long? He said. Taehyun, I'm asking her. Amara pulled her sleeve down. Her jaw was set. Several months, she said. Specific. Since the 3rd month. A pause. It was gradual at first. The dripping had stopped. The water had found the edge of its spread and gone still. Mommy has more, Nyla said. Every adult in the room turned to look at her. She was looking up at Taehyun with the expression she wore when she was making sure something important was understood. More hurts, she said. Mommy has more hurts. I saw them. Sayreen made a sound. Not a word. Something that was trying to be a word and didn't make it. She took a step forward. Taehyun moved between her and the child. It wasn't a large movement, just a shift of his weight, a repositioning of his body in the space between them. But it was absolute in the way that a wall is absolute. Not a suggestion, not a warning, just a fact about the physical world that had not previously been there. Saren stopped. She looked at his back. Then she looked at the room, at Amara, at Nyla, at the water on the floor, at the pitcher on the table, and the calculation that moved across her face in that moment was visible in a way it had never been when she thought anyone who mattered was watching. The mathematics of a situation going wrong, and the speed with which she was running new numbers. You're taking the word of a maid, she said, over mine. I'm looking at a bruise, he said. I'm listening to a child. He turned then, slowly, and looked at her. I'll form my own conclusions. She's manipulating you. She's been angling for what exactly? The question stopped her again. Because the answer to that question, whatever answer Sayreen had constructed to explain Amara's behavior to herself and to him, required a story in which Amara was the threat. And that story, in this room, with the water on the floor and the bruise on the arm and the child pointing, had a weight problem. I want you to go to your room, Taehyun said. You can't. I can. Still quiet. Still the same volume. Go. Saren looked at him for a long moment. The composed expression was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. A structural thing, deeper than expression. The particular change in a person's face when they understand that the ground they've been standing on has changed its nature. We'll talk about this properly, she said. When you've had time to knit. Saren. She went. The sound of her heels on the corridor floor lasted for 30 seconds, and then the house was quiet. Taehyun turned to Amara. Sit down, he said. I'm fine. You're soaking wet, and you've been standing on that ankle wrong for the past 4 minutes. He pulled a chair from the nearest table. Sit down. She sat. She hadn't known he'd noticed the ankle. She'd rolled it 3 days ago on the service stairs and had been compensating, she thought, without it showing. He crouched in front of her, which put him below her eye level, and looked at her the way he'd looked at the bruise cut, with a focused, complete attention that took its time. How much of it is documented? He said. She blinked. What? The damage log, Mrs. O's records. Anything you filed formally? How much? She looked at him. The Celadon vase. I filed a pre-existing damage report on Monday. Why that and not the rest? Because the rest... She stopped, started again. Because I couldn't prove the rest. The rest was my word. Against hers. Yes. He nodded slowly. He was still crouched, still at her level, and it occurred to her with a clarity that felt strange, given the circumstances that this was the closest she'd ever been to him in conversation. The physical proximity of it, the fact that there was no table or counter or professional distance between them. He smelled of coffee and something else she couldn't identify, something cold, like he'd been outside recently. "You've been here 10 months, he said. "Yes, and you didn't say anything." It wasn't an accusation. It was a question with the tone of a man who wanted to understand something, not assign blame. But it still landed with weight. "No," she said. "Why?" She looked at her hands in her lap. The sleeve was down over the bruise. "Because I needed this job," she said. "Because I needed the income and the health provision and the..." She stopped. "Because I did the math wrong." "What math?" "The math about what I was protecting her from versus what I was..." Her voice went level. She was watching it, the whole time. "I thought I was protecting her by staying. I was wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "You were protecting your child," he said. "That's not wrong math. That's what you had." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her with pity. She would have known what to do with pity. She'd had plenty of practice with pity. The particular condescension of being felt sorry for, the way it reduced you even while it reached toward you. What he was looking at her with was something else, something more precise, the way you look at a situation that you are responsible for regardless of whether you caused it. "Mrs. O," he said, standing. "She asked me this morning," Amar said. "I told her it was fine." "I know." He picked up the crystal pitcher and set it on the service tray. "She came to me an hour after the meeting in the corridor, last week." Amara stared at him. "She didn't report specifics," he said. "She told me there was a pattern in your behavior that she'd been observing, that you startled, that you deferred more than your performance record warranted." He paused. "She asked me to review the household dynamic." He looked at the pitcher. "I should have moved faster." The admission sat in the air between them, plain and undecorated. "You didn't know," Amara said. "I suspected something was wrong. I didn't know what. There's a difference between those things that I usually do not allow myself." He looked at her then, and there was something in it, the very edge of something that a man like him would not name or display, but that was legible if you knew what to look for. Not guilt exactly, its more useful cousin. "I won't make that distinction again." He crossed the room toward the door. "Get changed," he said. "There are dry clothes in the staff supply room. Mrs. O keeps emergency provisions. Have your arm looked at? I'll have Dr. Shin here within the hour. Don't leave the property." "Mr. Kang." He stopped. She didn't know what she'd been about to say. She sat in the wet chair in her ruined uniform and looked at the man who had just put his body between her daughter and the person hurting them, and the sentence she'd started had no reliable ending. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He left. Dr. Shin arrived in 50 minutes. He was a small, quiet man in his 60s who had worked with the estate for years and had the professional discretion of someone who had learned not to ask questions in this particular household, but documented everything with absolute thoroughness. He examined Amara's arm in the staff medical room, which Amara hadn't known existed until Mrs. O led her to it. A clean, functional space off the east corridor, not large, but equipped with everything necessary. 3 incidents, Dr. Shin said, looking at the arm. At minimum, the deepest contusion is layered. It was applied over an existing bruise. He photographed it without asking permission, which told Amara someone had already instructed him to do so. Any other sites? She showed him her ribs. He photographed those too. The marble counter, he said, in the tone of someone filling out a form. Yes. Was there direct physical force applied or impact during evasion? She thought about the hallway, Seirin stepping out, the tray in her hands, the lurch sideways. Evasion, she said. He nodded. He wrote something down. I'll have a full report prepared within 2 hours. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. You should have come sooner. I know, she said. He didn't push it. The part that came next was the part she hadn't prepared for. Not the examination, not the documentation, not the dry clothes from Mrs. O's supply closet that fit well enough. She'd been ready for those, or ready enough. The procedural elements of a crisis were, in their way, easier than the quiet. They gave her something to move through. What she hadn't prepared for was Tae-hyun's study. He came to her at 3 in the afternoon and said, without preamble, "I need you to walk me through it." And then he sat across from her at the table in his study. Not behind his desk, which she noticed at the table he used for meetings with people he was not trying to establish hierarchy with. And he listened. She talked for 45 minutes. She was specific. She'd decided, somewhere between the medical room and this chair, that she was done with the version of the truth that protected other people's comfort. She told him about the napkin, the corridor, the library, the vase, the room at night with the door opened without knocking, the thread about the reference, the specific words. You look at him like he's a person. At that one, he went very still. She told him about Nyla in the doorway, about the animal circle, about the tiger that had been moved to the perimeter. He didn't speak during any of it. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on her face, and he listened the way he did everything, completely, without the interruption of expression. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "The recording from last night," he said. "What recording?" "The banquet hall has coverage, part of the security network." He looked at the table. "I haven't reviewed it yet." "How much does it cover?" "Enough," he said. "The east wall, the service table." She understood. The picture, the floor, the marble, all of it in a fixed frame, time-stamped, permanent. "There are other rooms too," he said. "Not staff quarters, common areas, corridors." A pause. "I pulled the archive this morning. I haven't reviewed it yet. I'm going to." "Okay," she said. "What I find in that archive," he said, "will determine what happens next." There was something in how he said it. Not a threat, not directed at her, but a statement about a decision that had already been made in the part of him that made decisions before he'd consciously reached them, that told her exactly what he would find in the archive, and what would happen after. He looked at her. "You should have told me," he said. Not an accusation, just a fact, placed between them like something that would need to be accounted for. "I know," she said. "I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "Because she's very good at it," she said, "and I'm the maid." The silence that followed was the kind sighting that has mass. "You're not just the maid," he said finally. She didn't know what to say to that. She said nothing. He stood. "Stay in the house tonight, both of you. I'll have Mrs. O prepare a proper room in the main wing, not the staff quarters. Nyla's things should be moved. It's not a discussion," he said. Not unkindly. "You're not sleeping in the staff quarters tonight. Neither is she." He walked to the door. Amara sat at the table in his study for a moment after he left, in the quiet of a room that smelled of cedar and old paper, and something that she thought, irrationally, was the specific scent of a place where important things got decided. She thought about 10 months of wrong math. She thought about Nyla's tiger on the perimeter. She thought about the archive and the recordings and what Kang Tae-hyun would see when he sat down and reviewed them. What kind of man he would understand himself to have been, without knowing it, for the past 10 months. And she thought about what that understanding would cost. Down the hall she could hear Seiren's voice, muffled, controlled, the performance still running even now, even here, even after the room and the picture and the child's finger pointing across 40 feet of marble floor. Still running. And then she heard Taehyun's voice cut across it. Short, specific, with the zero temperature quality she'd heard in his phone call that morning. The voice of someone who has stopped managing the edges of a situation and has decided to take the center of it. The words didn't carry through the wall, the tone did. And in the new room Mrs. O was preparing in the main wing, 2 floors above the staff quarters where Amara had spent 10 months calculating what she couldn't afford to lose. Nyla was arranging her animals on a rug she'd never used before, placing the tiger at the edge of the circle, pointing outward, watching. The archive ran to 11 hours of footage. Tae-hyun reviewed it alone, in his security room, which was not a room most people in the house knew existed. It sat behind a panel in the east corridor, unremarkable, unmarked, accessible through a biometric lock that only he and his head of security used. Inside 4 screens, a server rack, a single chair. He sat in that chair at 4:17 in the afternoon, and he did not leave it until past midnight. He started with the past 30 days. He found what he expected to find within the first 2 hours, and then he kept watching because he needed to know the shape of the whole thing, not just the parts that confirmed what he already understood. That was how he had always worked. Not stopping when he had enough to act, but continuing until he had enough to be certain. Certainty was not the same as enough. He had learned that distinction in a context far more unforgiving than this one. What the cameras showed him was education in what had been happening inside his own house while he was managing everything outside it. The library, the books on the floor. Amara's hands picking them up 3 times, the third time with Saren's grip on her arm visible even at this angle, even through the slight degradation of the low-light recording. He watched the grip. He watched the duration of it. He watched Amara's body absorb it without retreating and understood, with the cold, specific clarity that had made him effective at everything he'd ever done, that this was not the first time that body had absorbed something it had no safe way to respond to. The corridor outside the kitchen. He watched Saren follow Amara around a corner and reappear 30 seconds later, walking at the easy pace of someone who has just concluded something satisfactorily. He watched Amara emerge 8 seconds after that and stand in the empty corridor for a moment, her hand against the wall, her head down. 8 seconds of a person collecting themselves. He had never seen her do that in any context where she thought someone might be watching. The banquet hall from that morning. He watched it once without stopping. Then he watched it again. He watched Saren come through the door with the specific energy of someone redirecting pressure from one source to another. He watched Amara hold her ground. He watched the pitcher lifted and the water and the specific way Amara's body responded to the cold. The gasp, the involuntary recoil, and then the spine straightening again, the hands coming back to her sides, the refusal to fold even soaked and standing on a marble floor that had become an exhibition of someone else's contempt. He watched Nyla come through the side door. The child had been there for 40 seconds before anyone noticed her. Standing in the doorway in her socks, her tiger in her hand, watching her mother with the particular quality of attention he'd noticed in her before and had not, until now, understood the source of. He watched her cross the room when he entered. He watched the point. He shut the archive down at 12:40 and sat in the dark of the security room for 3 minutes with his hands on his knees and the specific feeling of a man who has found something wrong inside something he was responsible for and now has to decide not whether to act, but how completely. He had made harder decisions than this one. None of them had felt like this. He went to Saren's room at 1 in the morning. She was awake. He had not expected otherwise. Saren did not sleep in situations she couldn't control, and this situation had been moving outside her control since 9:40 that morning. She was sitting at the vanity table in her robe when he opened the door, and she turned with the composed expression she'd been holding for hours, the one she'd been refining since the banquet hall, the version that said, "I have been waiting to be heard." He set a tablet on the vanity table in front of her. On the screen, a still image from the archive, the library, her hand on Amara's arm. The angle was clear. The grip was clear. Saren looked at it. She didn't look at him. "There's context, she started. "There are 11 hours of context," he said. "I've watched them." The composure shifted. Not broke. She was too practiced for that. But shifted. The way a structure shifts when the load exceeds what it was built for. She looked at the tablet, and then she looked at him, and she made a calculation that he could see her making, running through the options, testing each one for viability. "You've been recording the common areas," she said. "I always record the common areas." "You never told me that." "I never told anyone that." He took the tablet back. "It's a security protocol. It's not relevant to people who aren't doing anything worth recording." She was quiet for a moment. Then she shifted the angle. He watched her do it. The physical adjustment, the slight softening of her posture, the version of herself she deployed when the confrontational approach had run out of road. "Taehyun." Her voice went lower, more private. The version she used when she wanted him to understand that they were having a different kind of conversation now, an intimate one where the stakes were personal. "I know what that footage looks like. I know how it reads without the full context of what I've been dealing with. That woman has been—" "Don't." The word was small and total. Don't tell me what Amar has been doing. I know what Amar has been doing. I've watched her work in this house for 10 months. I've read 11 hours of footage in the last 8 hours. He set the tablet down on the vanity table and looked at her in the mirror rather than directly, the way you sometimes see a thing more clearly in its reflection. I know exactly what has been happening in this house. Saren looked at his reflection. So do you, he said. The silence stretched. I was managing the household, she said, the way you asked me to. I asked you to manage the household. I didn't ask you to do this. He touched the screen. The image. This is not management. She's a maid, Taehyun. She's a person, he said. Under my roof. Under my protection. Do you understand what that means to me? The question wasn't rhetorical. He was actually asking. And Saren, who had known him for 2 years and understood his codes better than most, heard what was underneath it. The specific register of a man who built his entire operational identity around the principle that things inside his perimeter did not get harmed. That was not sentiment. That was architecture. The foundation of everything he'd constructed, from the organization to the businesses to this house. The absolute rule that what he was responsible for did not get touched. She had touched it. For 10 months, she had touched it. In the rooms he wasn't watching, confident in the gap between what he saw and what was real. The gap had closed. I want you to tell me something, he said, and I want the actual answer, not the one you've been practicing since this morning. She said nothing. Why? Saren looked at her own reflection for a moment. Then she looked at his. Because she looked at you, she said finally. The way she looked at you. A pause. Like you were someone worth looking at. He held the look in the mirror. And you couldn't tolerate that, he said. I couldn't tolerate being invisible in my own house. The composure was still there, but the thing underneath it was visible now. Not remorse. Nothing as clean as remorse, but something rawer. The exposure of a person who has been running a performance for so long, they've partly forgotten the difference between the performance and themselves. Every room I walked into, she was there. Efficient, quiet, doing everything right. And you noticed. You always noticed. And you never noticed me the same way, So you hurt her. The bluntness of it stopped her. You hurt her child, he said. You frightened a 3-year-old girl to the point where she stopped laughing in rooms you entered. You did that because you were jealous of the way a woman looked at me. It's not more complicated than that. He picked up the tablet. I'm going to tell you what happens now. She went still. The engagement is over. The words landed in the room without ornamentation. He didn't raise his voice to deliver them or lower it. They were just true. And he said them the way he said true things. Saren's face did something complicated. The composure fractured, not completely, not all at once, but in the way glass fractures before it breaks, the lines appearing faster than the collapse. You can't. I can. He set the tablet on the vanity. You'll be moved out of the main wing tonight. Mrs. O will arrange the guest room in the south corridor. Tomorrow morning, your personal items will be packed under supervision and transported to your family home. You'll be escorted from this property by my security team. You're doing this because of a maid. I'm doing this because of what you are, he said, which I now know with certainty. He moved toward the door. The business connections between your family and my organization will be reviewed. Every contract, every arrangement, every agreement, reviewed and likely terminated. Saren stood up from the vanity. If you do that, your father will do what he can, Taehyun said, which won't be enough. You know that. I'll go to the media. The threat came out sharp and fast, the last option on the list. I'll tell them everything. About you, about the organization, You'll tell them what you have evidence of, he said. I'll tell them what I have evidence of. He looked at her steadily. We both know whose archive is more complete. She stared at him. He opened the door. Get some sleep, Saren, he said. Tomorrow is going to be a long day for your family. He closed the door behind him. In the corridor, he stood for exactly 4 seconds in the quiet of the house. His house. The house that had been running a lie inside it for 10 months while he managed everything outside. And he breathed. Then he went to find Mrs. O. Wolves. At 2 in the morning, the main wing guest room on the third floor had been prepared. Neela was already asleep in the large bed, her animals arranged on the pillow beside her, the tiger at the edge where it always was. Someone, Mrs. Oh, probably, had moved her things with enough care that the circle on the rug had been reconstructed exactly as it was, the positions preserved. Amara was sitting in the chair by the window when Taehyun knocked. She looked up. He was still in the same clothes from that morning, which told her what the past several hours had looked like for him. There were no visible signs of the evening on his face. He didn't carry things externally, but something in the set of his shoulders communicated the specific weight of a man who has spent hours looking at something he didn't want to see, and had looked anyway because that was who he was. "She'll be gone by noon tomorrow," he said. Amara nodded. "I've spoken to my legal team. There will be a formal separation of business ties with the Yoon family. That process starts tomorrow morning." He looked at Nyla sleeping. "Dr. Shin's report is filed. It will be kept in my personal records." "What does that mean?" "It means if she decides to make noise about any of this, the noise she makes will have a very specific answer." He looked back at Amara. "She won't make noise." She believed him, not because she was naive about what he was or what he could do, but because the particular certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a threat. It was the certainty of a man who understood leverage the way other people understood gravity, as a constant, not a choice. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "I had indications," he said. "Earlier than today. I prioritized other things." He held her eyes. "That won't happen again." The apology was not elaborate. It was not performed. It was the same plainness he brought to everything. The directness of a man who did not dress things up because dressing things up had never been a tool he needed. She sat with it for a moment. "I should have told you," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "and I should have made it easier for you to do that." He paused. "Both things are true." Outside the window, Seoul was still going, the lights of the city against the low gray sky, the permanent hum of a place that didn't stop for anything. She had hated this city for a period of her life and then stopped hating it because hating it required an energy she needed for other things. Now she sat in a window above it in a room she hadn't expected to be in tonight and looked at the man who had just said, "Both things are true," and thought about what it cost someone like him to say that. "Try to sleep," he said. He looked at Nyla one more time, at the sleeping child, at the animals on the pillow, at the tiger on the edge. "Both of you." He left. Amara sat in the chair for a while longer. Below, somewhere in the south corridor, she could hear movement, the distant, muffled sounds of a woman being relocated in her own defeat, the particular acoustic signature of a situation resolving in a direction it had never been supposed to go. She should have felt something clean about that. Relief, maybe. The specific release of a pressure that has been applied so long, the body has forgotten what it felt like without it. What she felt instead was more complicated. The way the end of a long, bad thing is always more complicated than the beginning of it, because the beginning was simple, just a door closing on something terrible, but the end requires you to stand in the space that's left and figure out what you're going to build there. She looked at Nyla, at the tiger. She thought about what the morning would bring, Seirin's departure, the legal machinery starting up, the conversations she would have to have with Mrs. O and Dr. Shin and probably others, the documentation, the process. All of it procedural and necessary, and in its own way as exhausting as what had preceded it. She thought about her nursing textbook on the cot in the staff quarters, the chapter on immune response, self and not self, and what happens when the body gets the distinction wrong. She thought about Taehyun's voice through the wall, cutting across Seirin's with zero temperature and absolute precision. Both things are true. She got up from the chair and crossed the room and lay down beside Nyla on the large bed, on top of the covers, still dressed. She put her arm around her daughter. She felt the rise and fall. She was almost asleep when Nyla stirred without waking and said, in the half-language of someone moving between states, "Tiger's still watching." "I know, baby," Amara said. "Good," Nyla said, and slept. The name came at 4:53 in the morning. Taehyun was at his desk when Junseo knocked. Not the security room, his actual desk, the one in the study where he'd spent the past 2 hours reviewing the financial documentation his legal team had been assembling through the night. He'd sent the lawyers home at 2 and kept working alone because working alone was how he processed, always had been. The absence of other people's reactions allowing him to think without managing anything. Junseo opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was not something he did. Not ever. In 6 years, Baek Junso had never opened a door without waiting. He set a single printed page on the desk. Taehyun looked at it. The name at the top was Park Sung-il. He sat with it for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked up at Junseo. "How long?" he said. 22 months, Junseo said. "Based on the earliest data point we can confirm. Possibly longer. 22 months. Before Seirin. Before the engagement. Before any of it. The information flowing out of his organization while he sat in this room and worked and trusted the people around him had been flowing for nearly 2 years. Park Sung-il had been his logistics director for 4 years. He'd recruited him personally from a rival operation after watching him manage a supply chain crisis with the specific competence of someone who understood both the legal and the shadow side of moving things between places. He'd trusted him with the subsidiary structures, the Busan operations, the cash flow architecture, all of it, all of it. "Where is he now?" Taehyun said. "Apartment in Mapo. He's been there since 10 last night. We have eyes on the building." "He knows?" "Not yet." Junso paused. "He made a call at midnight, encrypted, but we cracked it within the hour. He was reporting Seirin's departure, telling them the situation had changed, asking for instructions." "What did they tell him?" "To sit tight. That the legal strategy was still viable without the marriage." Junseo's face was completely flat. They told him to keep his position, that they'd find another approach. Taehyun looked at the page, at the name. 4 years. He'd sat across from this man in how many rooms? How many meetings? How many decisions made on the basis of information he'd provided? Operations structured around his logistics expertise, trust extended because the record seemed clean and the performance seemed genuine, and there had been, he now understood, no seemed about it. The performance had been genuine, which was the worst kind, because it required the person inside it to be genuinely good at the thing they were doing while simultaneously undoing it. He picked up his phone. He made one call. He said 4 words. Then he stood up and put on his jacket and went to Mapo. The building was a mid-range residential block 12 minutes from the estate by car, the kind of address that said, enough money to be comfortable, not enough to be conspicuous, the kind of address a man maintaining a double life would choose with care. Taehyun went in with Junseo and 2 others, which was 2 more than he usually brought to a conversation, but fewer than he could have justified given the circumstances. The elevator was slow. Nobody spoke in it. Park Sung-il answered the door in a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair flattened on one side from a pillow, his eyes moving from Taehyun to Junseo, to the 2 men behind him, in the time it took to take one breath. And in that time, in that single breath, that fraction of a second, Taehyun watched him make a calculation and watch it fail, and watched him understand that it had failed, and watched his face do the thing faces do when a person understands that the architecture they've been living inside has just collapsed. He stepped back from the door. They went in. The apartment was neat in the way of someone who lives alone and has military-adjacent habits. Nothing out of place, nothing decorative, the specific spareness of a man who has reduced his personal footprint to the minimum required for function. Taehyun took this in without comment. He sat in the single chair across from the couch. He waited while Park Sung-il remained standing near the window. "Sit down," Taehyun said. Sung-il sat. His hands were on his knees, not shaking. The hands of a man who has been running a specific kind of tension for 22 months and has developed a physiological tolerance for it. "How much?" Taehyun said. Sung-il looked at him. "How much did they pay you?" A pause. The calculation visible, not whether to tell the truth, but which version of the truth was survivable. "Enough to clear what I owed," Sung-il said finally, "and a position. After." "After what?" "After the restructuring." He held Taehyun's eyes. To his credit, or to the credit of whatever had made him effective at this for 4 years, he didn't look away. They were going to keep the organization running, just under different control. They needed people inside who knew how it worked. I was going to be retained, Taehyun said. Yes. The words sat in the apartment's silence like something that had fallen and broken. 22 months, Taehyun said. Sung-il said nothing. The Busan operation last spring. The supply chain restructure. The financing arrangements for the Gangnam properties. He watched Sung-il's face register each one. Not guilt, past guilt now. Something more exhausted than guilt. Recognition. The specific recognition of a man hearing the accurate list of his own actions. All of it went to them. Not all of it, Sung-il said. Taehyun looked at him. I kept some things out. The personnel files. The overseas contacts. He pressed his hands harder against his knees. I wasn't trying to destroy it. I was trying to... You were trying to survive the transition, Taehyun said. You were building your value to the new management by demonstrating how much you knew while preserving just enough to prove you still had something to offer me if it went wrong. He held the man's eyes. You were hedging. Sung-il didn't answer, which was the answer. The room was very quiet. Outside, the first gray light of a Seoul morning was pressing against the window. The city assembling itself for another day with the complete indifference to individual disasters that cities maintain as a matter of operational necessity. The debt positions, Taehyun said, 62% exposure across 3 asset categories. That breakdown came from you. Yes. The specific vulnerabilities in the subsidiary cash flow. Yes. The information that allowed them to structure a legal strategy viable enough to actually work. Sung-il's jaw tightened. Yes. Taehyun looked at him for a long moment. The kind of look that doesn't require expression because the weight of it is structural, built into the silence around it rather than the face making it. Why are you still alive? Taehyun said quietly. Not a threat. An actual question, phrased with the specific logic of a man whose organization operated by rules that were not written down but were universally understood. Sung-il's hands tightened on his knees. Because I want to know everything first, Taehyun said. Not what Junseo's analysis found, what you know, who you spoke to, what they told you about what comes next. He leaned forward slightly. Because the call you made at midnight tells me they don't consider this finished, and I need to understand what not finished looks like from their side. Sung-il stared at him. Talk to me, Taehyun said. Now, everything. And when you're done, I'll decide what the rest of this morning looks like. He talked for 90 minutes. Taehyun sat in the chair and listened the way he'd listened to Amara the day before, completely, without the interference of expression, letting the information land and accumulate and form its shape before he responded to any part of it. Junseo stood near the door and recorded everything on a device that would be transcribed and encrypted within the hour. What Sung-il told him was worse than the recording from the attorney's office. Not because the plan was more elaborate than he'd understood, it was largely as he'd understood it, but because of the timeline for what came next. The Yoon family had not built their strategy around Se-rin alone. She had been the primary instrument, the fastest, cleanest route to legal standing inside Tae-hyun's asset structure. But she had not been the only one. In parallel with the marriage strategy, the family's attorney had been preparing a regulatory complaint, a detailed filing with the Financial Services Commission alleging specific tax irregularities in 2 of the subsidiary companies. Irregularities built from information Sung-il had provided. Irregularities that were, in the technical sense, real, not fabricated, but selectively presented, stripped of the context that would make them explainable, shaped into a picture of systemic fraud by someone who understood exactly which details to include and which to omit. The complaint was already drafted. It had been drafted 6 weeks ago, held in reserve as the secondary strategy in case the marriage plan encountered complications. Se-rin's departure was a complication. The filing would go to the FSC within 48 hours unless the Yoon family's attorney received specific information suggesting the alternative approach was still viable. What alternative approach? Taehyun said. Sung-il hesitated. Sung-il. They want the Busan subsidiary, he said. Specifically, if you were to agree to a negotiated transfer of the Busan operation, voluntary, structured as a legitimate business sale. He stopped, started again. They'd withdraw the complaint, keep the rest of the strategy dormant. take what they could get. They want me to sell them the Busan operation to make a fabricated regulatory complaint go away. Yes. Taehyun looked at him for a long time. That's not a negotiation, he said. That's extortion. I know what it is. And you were going to tell me this when? Sung-il said nothing. The answer was not when. The answer was never, or not until the 48 hours had passed and the filing had gone in and the damage was done and survivability required choosing a side with finality. Taehyun stood up. Junseo moved instantly, not toward Sung-il, just into the room, repositioning with the automatic precision of long practice. The two men near the door straightened. Sung-il did not move from the couch. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on Taehyun, and the particular stillness of a man who has run out of calculations and is now simply waiting for the result of someone else's. The attorney's name, Taehyun said. Choi Byung-hwan. His office is in Yeouido. The specific FSC contact the complaint is routed to. Sung-il gave him a name. The account the payments came through. A pause. Then Sung-il gave him that too. Taehyun buttoned his jacket. He looked at Sung-il one last time, at the man he had trusted and promoted and put inside the architecture of everything he'd built, and he felt nothing that resembled what he'd expected to feel. Not rage. Rage would have been simpler. What he felt was the cold, specific weight of a person understanding the precise cost of having trusted someone, counted to the decimal place. You'll stay here, he said. Junseo's people will be outside. You won't make any calls. You won't contact anyone. He held the man's eyes. When this is finished, when I've done what needs to be done in the next 36 hours, we'll have a second conversation about your future. He paused. I'd recommend hoping the next 36 hours go well for my side. He left. The calls started in the car. His attorney first, not the household legal team, his primary counsel, the man who had been navigating the intersection of his legitimate and illegitimate interests for 11 years and had the specific skill set that intersection required. Taehyun told him about the FSC complaint in the same flat, precise tone he used for all operational communications, and listened while his attorney said words like preemptive disclosure and regulatory cooperation and counter-documentation and the specific phrase that Taehyun had been waiting for. They built this from selectively presented data, which means the complete data defeats it. How fast? Taehyun said. If I have everything Sung-il described by noon, you'll have it by 9. Then I can have a counter-filing ready before close of business today. Complete financials, full context documentation, the chain of evidence showing the complaint was built from deliberately partial information. A pause. We'd want to include the recording from Siren's meeting. The conspiracy angle strengthens the counterposition considerably. You'll have that too. Taehyun. His attorney's voice shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man who has been doing this long enough to say the thing other people don't say. If we file this counter-documentation, it's going to attract attention. FSC, media, potentially prosecutors looking at the Yoon family's conduct. This won't stay quiet. I know, Taehyun said. You want it loud. He looked out the window at Seoul assembling its morning, the traffic building, the storefronts opening, the city doing what cities do without reference to any individual disaster occurring within it. I want it finished, he said. He was back at the estate by 7:15. Amara was in the East Corridor. Of course she was. 4:30 start, East Corridor first, the rotation she had maintained through 10 months of everything that had been done to her inside this house. He stopped when he saw her and she looked up from the supply cart and read his face. He saw her do it, the quick specific assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate a room's temperature before they said anything. What happened? She said. He told her. Not everything. Not Sung-il, not the detail of the apartment, or the 90 minutes, or what came next for the man who had spent 4 years eating at his table. But the FSC complaint, the 48-hour window, what his attorney was doing right now. She listened the way she'd listened to everything, without performance, without the filler responses people deploy to signal engagement, just actual listening. They're not done, she said when he finished. No, even with her gone, even with the recording. They invested too much, he said. The debt positions, the attorney work, 22 months of intelligence gathering. They need a return on that investment. The FSC complaint is the fallback. He looked at the east corridor. The tiles she had polished every morning, the bronzes she had straightened, the surfaces that held the careful invisible record of her labor in this house. If it goes in and the subsidiaries come under investigation, it creates enough disruption to make the Busan operation vulnerable. They can acquire distressed assets at a fraction of the cost of the original plan. So even without the marriage, they get something. If I don't move fast enough, yes. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her process it. Not the fear response, not the overwhelm, but the specific cognition of someone running the numbers on a situation and assessing the variables. "What can I do?" she said. He looked at her. "My testimony," she said. "Dr. Shin's report. The archive footage. You said it was part of the evidentiary picture, that it established bad faith." She held his eyes. If the counterfiling needs to show the complaint was built on deliberate manipulation, then showing who she was and what she was doing inside this house is part of that picture. It shows the whole strategy, not just the financial piece. She paused. "I'll give testimony, formally, whatever your attorney needs." He looked at her for a long moment. "You understand what that means," he said. "Your name, Nyla's name, in a legal filing that's going to be public." "My name is already in Dr. Shin's report," she said, "which is already in your personal records, which aren't going to stay personal if this gets to prosecutors." She held his eyes. "I've been a witness to this since the beginning. Trying to stay invisible didn't protect me. Staying visible to the right people might." The corridor was very quiet. The city was waking up outside the walls, indifferent as always, and inside these walls, everything that had been building for 22 months, the intelligence gathering, the debt positions, the performance of intimacy, the systematic isolation of a woman who had seen too much, was converging on the next 36 hours with the specific momentum of a thing that has been in motion too long to stop gradually. He said, "My attorney will need to speak with you this morning." She said, "I know." He looked at her in the east corridor of his house, in the early light, with her supply cart beside her and her uniform, and the particular quality of stillness she carried that he had been noticing for 10 months without allowing himself to name, and he understood with a precision that surprised him, given everything else he was managing at this exact moment, that the thing he had almost lost in the past 24 hours was not only his organization. He didn't say that. It was not the moment. "I'll have Mrs. O set up the library for the meeting," he said. 9 o'clock. "I'll be there," she said. He walked toward his study. Behind him he heard the sound of her returning to work. The soft, specific sounds of the east corridor rotation continuing. The bronzes, the tiles, the invisible necessary labor that had been happening every morning at 4:30 for 10 months, while the world around it burned and plotted and failed to notice. His phone rang. His attorney. He answered it. "We have a problem," his attorney said. "The FSC filing, it didn't go in 48 hours from now." Taehyun stopped walking. "It went in this morning," his attorney said. "An hour ago. Someone moved the timeline." The corridor was very still. "How long do we have?" Taehyun said. "The preliminary review triggers in 6 hours," his attorney said. "After that, the investigation becomes automatic. We can't counterfile after trigger. We'd have to respond inside the process, which takes months and leaves the subsidiaries exposed the entire—" "How long?" Taehyun said again. A pause. 5 hours and 40 minutes, his attorney said. "Maybe less." Taehyun stood in this corridor of his house with his phone against his ear and the specific sensation of a clock that had been running in a distant room suddenly becoming audible. And somewhere in the city, in an office in Yeouido, a man named Choi Byung-hwan was sitting behind a desk. Taehyun was already moving before the call ended. Not running. He didn't run, had never run toward anything in his professional life because running communicated panic, and panic communicated weakness, and weakness in his world was not a posture you adopted even in the 5 minutes before everything burned down. But he moved with the particular velocity of a man who has compressed an entire decision tree into a single second and is now executing the output. He called Junseo first. 2 sentences. Junseo said nothing, which meant understood, and the call ended. He called his attorney back. Get everything you have into a preliminary package now, not the full counterfiling. Maid, the core documents, the recording, the debt position evidence, the chain showing the complaint was constructed from partial data. Send it to my direct line in 40 minutes. That's not enough to... It doesn't need to be enough to win, Tae-hyun said. It needs to be enough to make noise. Send it. He ended the call and went to his study and sat at his desk and did the thing he did when a situation had moved faster than the plan for it. He went still. Not passive, the specific active stillness of a man reorganizing his resources in real time, assessing what he had versus what the next 5 hours required, cutting everything that wasn't load-bearing. What he had, a recording of Saerin and her family's attorney outlining a conspiracy to defraud, a medical report documenting physical abuse of a household employee, archive footage constituting corroborating evidence of that abuse, a logistics director willing to testify about the information he'd passed to the Yoon family over 22 months in exchange for whatever consideration Tae-hyun decided to extend him, and a woman in the East Corridor who had just told him she would put her name on a legal document in the middle of the worst 36 hours his organization had faced in a decade. What the Yoon family had, a filed regulatory complaint built on selectively presented financial data, 6 hours before it triggered automatic review, and the reasonable expectation that Tae-hyun would spend those 6 hours trying to navigate the FSC process rather than going directly at the architecture of the complaint itself. The reasonable expectation was wrong. He picked up his phone and called a number he used rarely, a contact at a financial journalism desk who had been sitting on a story about the Yoon family's acquisition practices for 8 months, waiting for documentation specific enough to print. Tae-hyun had known about the story for 6 of those 8 months and had filed it as a potential asset without knowing when he'd need it. He needed it now. "I have documentation," he said when the call connected. "The Yoon family has filed a regulatory complaint against one of my subsidiaries this morning. The complaint was constructed from information obtained through corporate espionage and conspiracy. I have a recording of the planning session and a 22-month paper trail of the intelligence operation behind it." He paused. "I'm sending you the core documents in 40 minutes. What you do with them in the next 4 hours determines whether this story is about a regulatory investigation or about the investigation of an investigation." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Then, "Send everything." He ended the call. He sat for a moment in the quiet of his study. The city was fully awake outside now, the sound of it constant and indifferent. And somewhere in that city, a man named Choi Byung-hwan was sitting behind a desk in Yeouido, believing he had moved faster than the person he was moving against. Tae-hyun thought about Saerin's voice on the recording. He knows, and what he can do about it would be 2 different things. He stood up and went to find Amara. She was exactly where he'd left her. Not the East Corridor. She'd finished the rotation, had moved through to the secondary sitting room, was on her knees rehanging a curtain panel that had come loose from its track. When he appeared in the doorway, she looked up and read his face and got to her feet in one motion without being asked. "The filing went in early," he said. "We have 5 hours. What do you need? My attorney needs your statement now, not at 9. Now." He looked at her. "And I need to ask you something I don't have the right to ask." She held his eyes. "Ask it." "The statement will go into a counter-documentation package that my attorney is going to leak to a financial journalist before the FSC preliminary review triggers. That's the strategy. Make enough public noise about the source and method of the complaint that the FSC has to pause the automatic review process to assess the complaint's integrity." He paused. "When that documentation goes public, your name is in it. Dr. Shin's report. The footage timestamps. Everything you told me yesterday." He held her gaze. "It becomes a media story before it becomes a legal one. The abuse, the conspiracy, the maid and the mafia boss, and a 3-year-old girl. It becomes that story." She was very still. "Nyla's name," she said. "I won't include Nyla's name without your explicit consent. She can be referenced as a minor witness without identification." He held her eyes. "But your name, Amara. I can't protect that and still make this work." The sitting room was quiet. Outside the window, the garden was gray and cold, the sculpted hedges holding their shape against the flat winter sky. She thought about the nursing textbook, 11 months. She thought about the air mattress in Diane's spare room. She thought about every morning in the East Corridor, every morning at 4:30 with the cold coming through her uniform and the ache in her ribs and the sound of Sarene's heels on the upper stairs that had become, over 10 months, the specific sound of her own powerlessness. She thought about Nyla saying, "She looks at me like I'm dirty." "Do it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "You understand what it means to be in a public story connected to this organization." "I understand what it means to let you lose because I was afraid of being seen," she said. "I've been invisible for 10 months. It didn't protect either of us." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once and took out his phone and called his attorney and said, "She's ready. Come now." The attorney arrived in 22 minutes. His name was Han Dong-wook, and he was 60 years old and had the specific quality of someone who had been in difficult rooms for so long that difficulty had become his natural atmosphere. He moved through it without friction, setting up his recording equipment on the library table with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this in worse places than this. He recorded Amara's statement in 55 minutes. She was specific. She was chronological. She used dates when she had them and approximate timeframes when she didn't, and she did not editorialize and she did not perform. And her voice maintained the specific, steady quality it had maintained through every hard thing in this house. Not the steadiness of someone who isn't feeling it, but the steadiness of someone who has decided that feeling it and functioning through it are not mutually exclusive. When she described the grip above the elbow, Han Dong-wook asked her to indicate the location on her own arm, and she pushed up her sleeve and pointed, and he noted it in the record. When she described Nyla in the doorway of the sitting room, her voice did something. A very small thing, a fractional loss of steadiness at the bottom of a sentence. And she stopped and breathed and continued. When she described the banquet hall, the pitcher, the floor, the cold, the sound of water dripping on marble, and Nyla running across the room to reach Tae-hyun's leg. Han Dong-wook put his pen down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been in difficult rooms for 40 years and has just heard something that will stay with him. "That's sufficient," he said quietly. "I'm not done," she said. She finished. The documentation package went to the journalist at 9:47. The story went live online at 11:12, which was 11 minutes before the FSC preliminary review was scheduled to trigger. It was not a subtle story. The headline named the Yoon family directly. It named the attorney. It described the recording, not quoted, not reproduced, but described with enough specific detail that anyone reading it understood what the recording contained. It described the 22-month intelligence operation. It described the conspiracy to use a fabricated regulatory complaint as leverage for forced asset acquisition. And near the end, in 3 paragraphs that were precise and carefully sourced, it described what had been happening inside the Kang Estates household for the 10 months of Sarene's access. The medical documentation, the archive evidence, the systematic abuse of a woman who had no structural power to report it. It named Amara. It did not name Nyla. By 11:30, the FSC had received 3 separate inquiries from other journalists asking whether the commission was aware that a complaint filed that morning was the subject of a counter-allegation of fraud. By noon, the preliminary review had been suspended pending an integrity assessment of the complaint source documentation. By 1 in the afternoon, the Yoon family's attorney had issued a statement through a PR firm saying the allegations were without merit and would be vigorously contested. By 2, the PR firm had resigned the account. Tae-hyun watched it from his study. Not with satisfaction. Satisfaction was not the right word for what happened when a crisis resolved, when the machine you'd built to protect what you'd built held under pressure. What he felt was something closer to the particular bone-deep exhaustion of a man who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally been able to set it down. He thought about Park Sung-il in the Mapo apartment. He made a call. 2 sentences. The call ended. Sung-il would not be retained. He would not be harmed. Tae-hyun had decided that in the car on the way back from Mapo, not from mercy exactly, but from the cold calculation that a man who had given everything in that apartment, who had handed over names and accounts, and the full architecture of what he'd done, who had cooperated completely at the moment cooperation was the only option, had paid a price that was sufficient for what he'd done. He would be removed. His access would be severed. His finances would be reviewed, and what was recoverable would be recovered. He would spend the rest of his professional life carrying the knowledge of what he'd been and what he'd lost and who he'd been when it mattered. That, Taehyun had decided, was enough. He sat in his study with the story running on 3 screens and the calls coming in from his board, his overseas partners, his people, all of them wanting the same thing, which was to understand what had happened and what it meant for them. And he answered each one with the same plain, unadorned version of the truth. We were targeted, we identified it, we responded, we're stable. He said it 8 times over the course of the afternoon, and by the 8th time the word stable had stopped feeling like a claim and started feeling like an accurate description. At 4:30, the house went quiet. The attorneys had left. Junseo had taken his team back to their standard positions. Mrs. O had done a walkthrough and produced a list of things requiring attention over the next week, which she set on Taehyun's desk with the particular composure of a woman who had worked through the past 24 hours without once losing her operational bearing, and which Taehyun would recognize later, looking back, as one of the most valuable things anyone in this house had done during the crisis. He went to find Amara. She was in the guest room, not on her knees, not on her rotation, sitting in the window chair with Nyla in her lap, the child drowsing against her shoulder in the half-awake state of late afternoon, the plastic tiger loose in her hand. He knocked on the open door. Amara looked up. She looked, he thought, like someone who had just set something down. Not empty, but lighter. The particular quality of a person who has been carrying the weight of a decision for weeks and has finally made it and has not yet decided what to do with the hands that used to be holding it. He came in. He sat in the other chair across the room at the distance appropriate to the hour and the situation and the particular care he was taking with the geometry of this. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She'd been following it on her phone. He'd had Mrs. O give her access to the relevant news feeds, which was the least he could do for someone whose name was now attached to a story that was running on every major financial and general interest site in Korea. "The FSC," she said, "suspended. The Yoon family's legal team filed a withdrawal of the complaint an hour ago. Preemptive, say they withdrew it before the integrity assessment could come back, which tells you what the assessment would have found." He looked at his hands. "My attorneys will be filing the criminal conspiracy referral tomorrow. The regulatory violations in the debt position strategy have been flagged to the relevant oversight bodies." He paused. "It will take months. The legal process is slow, but the direction is set." "Seirin," she said. "Her family's attorneys have been in contact about a negotiated resolution of the criminal exposure. She'll cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced personal liability." He held Amara's eyes. "She will not come near this house or you or Nyla again. That's not negotiable, and she knows it." Neela stirred against Amara's shoulder. Resettled. Her fingers tightened slightly on the tiger. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city was moving into its evening phase. The lights beginning, the sky at the specific color it turns in Seoul in winter just before full dark, somewhere between gray and blue, the color of something that has been cold for a long time and has accepted it. "I owe you more than an apology," Taehyun said. She looked at him. "I owe you a direct accounting of what I failed to do," he said. "I noticed things. I noticed them early. Mrs. O flagged things, and I told myself I was managing too many other priorities." He held her eyes without flinching. "I told myself the household was not in crisis because I didn't want to look directly at the possibility that I had made an error in judgment about someone I trusted." He paused. "That's the accurate account. Not that I didn't know. That I chose not to know." The admission sat in the room, plain and without decoration. Amara was quiet for a moment. She was stroking Nyla's hair. A slow, automatic motion, the thing the hands do when they need to be doing something while the mind is elsewhere. "I chose not to speak," she said, "for the same reason. I didn't want to look at what it would cost to change something I depended on." She looked at the window. "We both ran the wrong math." "Yes," he said. Both things are true, she said, returning his own words to him, which he recognized. He nodded. The light outside the window shifted, a car somewhere on the private drive, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the room. Nyla made a small sound and pulled the tiger closer and slept. I want to ask you something, Taehyun said. She looked at him. Stay, he said. Not because the position requires it, not because of what you witnessed or what your testimony contributed or any professional obligation. He held her eyes. Stay because this house is better for your being in it, because Nyla deserves to grow up somewhere that is already safer than where she was, and I can make it more so. He paused. And because I would like the opportunity to demonstrate over time that my word about what happens inside these walls means something. Not as an employer, as a... He stopped, found the word with the precision he brought to everything. As someone who would like to be trusted by you, eventually, when the grounds for it have been established. The room was very still. Amara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had built an empire on the principle that loyalty was the first law and had found the breach in his own foundation and had spent 36 hours closing it while someone burned his house down around him. At the man who had crouched below her eye level and listened and said both things are true. At the man who had put his body between her daughter and the thing that was hurting her. I want to finish my degree, she said. I know. I want Nyla in a proper school, not a room off the kitchen with a small television. There are 3 schools within 4 kilometers that have openings. I've already had Mrs. O pull the information. A pause. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes one, the shift in the architecture of the face that happens when the body has decided something before the mind has finished deliberating. You pulled school information, she said, this morning, between the attorney call and the journalist call. He looked at her without apology. I was managing several things simultaneously. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked down at Nyla. Okay, she said, quiet and direct and certain. The same words she'd said in the security room, in a different context, with the same quality of decision behind it. He nodded. He stood. He was almost to the door when she said, Mr. Kang. He stopped. What you said before, about wanting to be trusted. She was still looking at Nyla, at the sleeping child and the tiger in her hand. You already are. That's not the thing that needs time. She looked up at him. What needs time is everything else. He held the look. I have time, he said. He left. Bashant. Weeks passed, then months. The Yoon family's public collapse was not swift. These things never are. The legal machinery grinding with the slowness that is its only reliable characteristic. But it was complete. The criminal conspiracy referral produced indictments. The deposition strategy unraveled under regulatory review, costing the family 3 years of accumulated financial architecture in the space of a single quarter. The attorney Choi Byung-hwan surrendered his license in lieu of prosecution on the conspiracy charge. Seirin entered a cooperation agreement that kept her out of a courtroom but put her on record in permanent legal documentation as an active participant in a scheme to defraud. The media ran it for 2 weeks, then moved on, which was what media did, and which was, in its own way, a mercy. Inside the Black Phoenix Syndicate, Taehyun introduced new protocols, not announced, not formalized with ceremony, just implemented, the way he implemented everything, through the quiet revision of standing policy. Every employee, regardless of rank or role, was covered under a formal protection standard. Reports of mistreatment, from any source, in any direction, would reach him directly, not filtered through any intermediate layer. The standard was called internally, by the people who worked within it, simply the rule. Some of them knew where it came from. Most of them just knew it was real. Nyla started school on a Tuesday in March. She wore a yellow raincoat and carried a backpack that was almost as large as she was, and she walked through the school gate holding her mother's hand with the particular seriousness of someone undertaking a significant mission. She had left the tiger at home. When Amara asked if she was sure, Nyla had said, "Tiger watches the house when we're not there." The logic was irrefutable. Amara stood outside the school gate after drop-off, and let the morning sit with her for a moment. The cold had broken slightly. Not spring yet, but the edge off it, the air carrying something that hadn't been there last week. She stood on the sidewalk of a street in Seoul, which was a city she had hated for a period, and stopped hating and was now, she thought, beginning to understand the way you begin to understand a language you've been living inside long enough to stop translating. She had 6 months left in the nursing program. She had an exam in 2 weeks that she was ready for. She had a room in the main wing of a house she had once arrived at before dawn, every morning like an apology, and which she now moved through with the easy, specific confidence of someone who belongs somewhere and has stopped being surprised by that. On an evening in April, she found Tae-hyun in the garden. He was not there often. The garden was Mrs. O's operational domain, and he spent his time in his study or in the world outside the walls that his work required him to inhabit. But occasionally she found him here, standing at the far end of the main path near the stone bench that no one ever sat on, looking at something in the middle distance that was not the hedges or the wall or the city visible above it. She sat on the stone bench. He looked at her. She said, "Nyla asked me today why the people at the syndicate call her brave." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know." She looked at him. "What should I have told her?" He sat beside her, not close, the appropriate distance for an April evening in a garden between two people who are taking their time with something. "I told some of my people about her," he said, "about what she said in the banquet hall, about the finger." He paused. "In my organization, honesty at cost is the thing we value most and find least. Most people, when the moment comes, calculate the risk and choose silence." He looked at the middle distance. She was 3 years old, and she looked at the most dangerous man she knew, and she told him the truth without calculating anything. He paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually most of what matters." Das Romantikum Tatsin. Amara sat with that. "She put the tiger at the edge of the circle," she said. "I know." She was 3. She didn't have any other tools. She looked at her hands. She used what she had. He looked at her then, directly. With the focused, complete attention she had come to understand was the most honest thing he was capable of. Not words, not gesture, but this, the quality of presence he brought to bear when something was worth being present for. "So did you," he said. The garden was quiet. The city moved behind the wall, indifferent and constant and alive in its way. The stone bench was cold, but not unbearably so. The light was going, the sky doing what Seoul skies do in April, softening rather than darkening, the day releasing itself gradually. She thought about 4:30 in the morning, about the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a hand reaching down, about the math she'd run for months that had never quite added up to enough, about the decision she'd made on a night when she was soaking wet and standing on someone else's marble floor, that she would stop running numbers and start telling the truth. It hadn't felt like courage then. It had felt like exhaustion, like the end of the capacity to absorb. Maybe those were the same thing, she thought. Maybe courage was just what exhaustion looked like from the outside, when the person who was done absorbing happened to be someone whose testimony mattered. Maybe it didn't matter what it was called. What mattered was what it had built. She looked at the stone bench, at the garden, at the wall above which the city was still going, still indifferent, still entirely unconcerned with any individual life occurring within its borders. "She wants a dog," Amara said. He blinked. "Nyla. She wants a dog. She's been asking for 3 weeks." She looked at him. "I told her I'd think about it." A pause. Something shifted in his face. Something that was not quite the smile she'd seen him almost produce twice before, but was closer to it than anything else she'd seen. The expression of a man remembering how to occupy the parts of himself he'd placed in storage. "What kind of dog?" he said. "She said big," Amara said. "She said big enough to sleep at the edge of the bed." He looked at the garden. "Big enough to watch," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I know someone," he said. She looked at him. "A breeder," he said. "Reputable. Outside the city." She held his eyes. "Of course you do." The almost smile arrived. And in that garden in April, in the quiet space between an empire that had survived and a life that was still being built from the materials available, Two people sat on a cold stone bench and let the evening come down around them without filling it with anything it didn't need. The tiger was home, watching the door, and everything inside the walls was safe.